Hi there. This is reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Chapter 20, Part 2. So, the Phaedrus project has three phases. The first one is the fun one in the classroom, just kind of exploring what quality is. The second is the metaphysical phase, where he goes between the horn of the bull. And the third one is the mystical phase. And this is the phase we're talking about in this chapter, or at least in this part of the chapter. So much of this book is about reconciling opposites. In fact, you could largely say this is what the book is about. Romantic and classic, hip and square, valley and mountain, the narrator and Phaedrus, and now we're entering another realm of an attempt at reconciliation, and that's the metaphysical and the mystical. So I'm going to do what I did in part one. I'm going to read the whole thing. I don't really see any way around it. The material here is technically the basis of Pirsig's metaphysics, and the sequential process at how he arrives at it is important. So it's not a great idea to leave anything out. So sit back, because this is going to be a long one. He'd been speculating about the relationship of quality to mind and matter, and had identified quality as the parent of mind and matter, that event which gives birth to mind and matter. This Copernican inversion of the relationship of quality to the objective world could sound mysterious if not carefully explained. But he didn't mean it to be mysterious. He simply meant that at the cutting edge of time, before an object can be distinguished, there must be a kind of non-intellectual awareness, which you call awareness of quality. You can't be aware that you've seen a tree until after you've seen the tree, and between the instant of vision and the instant of awareness, there must be a time lag. We sometimes think of that time lag as unimportant, but there's no justification for thinking that the time lag is unimportant. None whatsoever. The mystery of this Copernican inversion may make the word Copernican sound like hyperbole. And I think that's why he's downplaying it a little, is he's getting us used to the implications of what he's saying. That and the fact that once you see it, it is simple. But it takes some insight to see it. It's kind of like the insight it takes to see Newton's ghost, in a way. So Pirsig wrote this book before the neuroscience explosion of the late 90s, or the late 80s rather. In 1989, there was a book called Descartes' Error, in which the author, neurobiologist Antonio Damasio, proves that we do not make decisions logically. Now, for those of you in neuroscience out there, this is the one that I know of, and there's probably others, because this was sort of coming to the fore as neuroscience, this way of understanding how cognition operates. And this is, I think, maybe John can correct me here, but I think that this late 80s neuroscience stuff begins to be the basis of, is a lot of the basis of cognitive science, but I may be wrong there. So Damasio proved we don't make decisions logically. We make them based on an emotional response. And like I'm saying, this type of discovery in neuroscience is the basis of a lot of how we know that we think now. And it's the basis of, say, Jonathan Haidt's elephant rider analogy, where the elephant reacts to whatever the immediate stimulus is, and the rider takes over and makes sense of and usually justifies the elephant's reaction. This passage also makes us think about the meaning of time. How we perceive time passing is based on our conscious perception of it. So this lag in between perception and intellectualization is so tiny, so imperceptible, that if we're looking at things in terms of, our consciousness, we discount it. But as Pirsig says, there's no justification for that. Are long periods of time good and short periods of time inconsequential? Your life can end in a split second, the same amount of time it takes for a baby to be conceived. The past exists only in our memories, the future only in our plans. The present is our only reality. That tree that you are aware of intellectually, because of that small time lag, is always in the past and therefore is always unreal. Any intellectually conceived object is always in the past and therefore unreal. Reality is always the moment of vision before the intellectualization takes place. There is no other reality. This pre-intellectual reality is what Phaedrus felt he had properly identified as quality. Since all intellectually identifiable things must emerge from this pre-intellectual reality, quality is the parent, the source of all subjects and objects. So for thousands of years, the mystics have told us that the present is what counts, and that, in Buddhism, dukkha, all pain comes from an unawareness of that, from rehashing and rehearsing, from rehashing our past and rehearsing our future. And we've often heard people speculate on the thought experiment that everything we perceive of is in the past. That comes up a lot. It comes up at cocktail parties and whatnot. But by expressing it as any intellectually conceived object is always in the past and therefore unreal has been a tenet of Eastern philosophy. It's really in the West that this whole mind-matter thing is a conundrum. And the Eastern philosophies don't see it that way. They see the present moment as being reality. But the Eastern philosophies also see time as circular, if we're talking about time. And circular time is kind of a problem for operating in the modern world. He felt that intellectuals usually have the greatest trouble seeing this quality precisely because they are so swift and absolute about snapping everything into intellectual form. The ones who have the easiest time seeing this quality are small children, uneducated people, and culturally deprived people. These have the least predisposition toward intellectuality from cultural sources and have the least formal training to instill it further into them. That, he felt, is why squareness is such a uniquely intellectual disease. He felt he'd been accidentally immunized from it, or at least to some extent broken from the habit by his failure from school. After that, he felt no compulsive identification with intellectuality and could examine anti-intellectual doctrines with sympathy. I'm going to say that some of those anti-intellectual doctrines would be the more mystical Eastern philosophies. So back to Eastern philosophy, the concept of the beginner's mind in Zen is to have a mind like a child, open and receptive to reality as it presents itself to you. This is the basis, again, of mystical experience, and this is why Zen practice is years long, to get you to the point of being able to do that, of your authentic self, let's just say, the self you were before you were born, is what they say in Zen. Zen practice is about breaking the habit. Squares, he said, because of their prejudices towards intellectuality, usually regard quality, the pre-intellectual reality, as unimportant, a mere uneventful transition period between objective reality and subjective perception of it. Because they have preconceived ideas of its unimportance, they don't seek to find out if it's in any way different from their intellectual conception of it. Again, if you think the world consists of subjects and objects, minutiae like little lags in time seem inconsequential and they're discounted. Does that make them go away? It is different, he said, once you begin to hear the sound of that quality, see that Korean wall, that non-intellectual reality in its pure form, you want to forget all that word stuff, which you finally begin to see is always somewhere else. So we know what the Korean wall is at this point. I guess you could call it vernacular architecture, which is a fancy way of saying people just build it because it's needed. In the case of the Korean wall, however, it's built with a sort of in-the-moment care, and this in-the-moment care manifests into this symmetrical beauty. And this was the catalyst for Phaedrus going in the direction he did, meaning that he realized somehow what he was looking for was not in the Church of Reason alone, but also in Eastern philosophy, in the unification of the East and West, like that book he came across. Another variation of the unification project we were talking about. All that word stuff, necessary? Well, yeah, if you're going to communicate, but that's the issue. we do have to communicate. So that's a bit of a problem there. You know, you will need the word stuff at some point. Now, armed with this new time interrelated metaphysical trinity, he had that romantic classic quality split. The one which had threatened to ruin him completely stopped. They couldn't cut up quality now. He could sit there and at his leisure cut them up. What a nice position to be in, that you know you're on the right track. You know without a question of a doubt you're on the right track, and you have your time, you know. You have time to, you have leisure time to really work it out. Romantic quality always correlated with instantaneous impressions. Square quality always involved multiple considerations that extended over a period of time. Romantic quality was the present, the here and now of things. Classic quality was always concerned with more than just the present. The relation of the present to the past and the future was always considered. If you conceive the past and the future to be all contained in the present, why, that was groovy. The present is what you lived for. And if your motorcycle is working, why worry about it? But if you consider the present to be merely an instant between the past and the future, just a passing moment, then to neglect the past and future for the present is bad quality indeed. The motorcycle may be working now, but when was the oil level last checked? Fuss budgetry from the romantic view, but good common sense from the classic. So what's happening here? The phrase to pay attention to is always considered. Both elements of time have to be considered all the time. They have to be always considered. Otherwise, you choose between two extremes, you know, each with its own benefit, but with a severe deficit. I think this passage, you know, kind of demonstrates how the two are dependent on each other, interrelated. Now we had two different kinds of quality, but they no longer split quality itself. They were just two different time aspects of quality, short and long. What had previously been asked for was a metaphysical hierarchy that looked like this. What he gave them in return was a metaphysical hierarchy that looked like this. The quality he was teaching was not just part of reality, it was the whole thing. So these graphics show really what is a definition of a paradigm shift, no less than an entirely new metaphysics, the actual restructuring of our relationship with reality. Now, do you think he was using hyperbole earlier when he said a Copernican inversion? He then proceeded in terms of the Trinity to answer the question, why does everybody see quality differently? This was the question he had always had to answer speciously before. Now, he said, quality is shapeless, formless, indescribable. To see shapes and forms is to intellectualize. Quality is independent of any such shapes and forms. The names, the shapes, and forms we give quality depend only partly on the quality. They also depend partly on the a priori images we have accumulated in our memory. We constantly seek to find in the quality event analogues to our previous experiences. If we didn't, we'd be unable to act. We build up our language in terms of these analogues. We build up our whole culture in terms of these analogues. Not going to go into the language part here so much. It's going to come up later, but I'm also kind of weak on it. So those of you who are interested in how language creates our reality, please put some comments below because I think it's very interesting. Another word you could use for analogs, and I guess I'm getting into this a little bit, is metaphors. And I've come across other thinkers that believe that where we are now, how consciousness has evolved, is based on a layering of metaphors. And some of these thinkers, of course, include the big one, George Lakoff, but look at Julian Jaynes, you know, the bicameral mind book. There's a whole section on metaphors and how that's changed our consciousness. It's very interesting. Also, if you look at Jordan Peterson's maps of meaning, you'll see a graphic that mirrors this concept. I mean, how something that happens in the world is interpreted and then is dramatically acted out, and this is the basis of religion. That's kind of muddled the way I said that because I don't quite remember how he puts it. But if you look at the beginning part of Maps of Meaning, you'll find that section. Obviously, it's in John Vervaeke's work. And there's going to be a lot of other people that I don't know of. You know, these metaphors and how they create, I guess, how they create the way we think, or how they Anyway, they metaphors are important. The reason people see quality differently, he said, is because they come to it with different sets of analogs. He gave linguistic examples showing that to us the Hindi letters da, 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 and da, dha, all sound identical because we don't have analogs to them to sensitize us to their differences. Similarly, most Hindi-speaking people cannot distinguish between da, and the because they are not so sensitized. It is not uncommon, he said, for Indian villagers to see ghosts, but they have a terrible time seeing the law of gravity. So does that section in chapter 3 make sense now about the law of gravity being a ghost? Let's revisit his argument as to why the law of gravity is just as much of a ghost. If the law of gravity existed, I say, I honestly don't know what a thing has to do to be non-existent. It seems to me that the law of gravity has passed every test of non-existence there is. You cannot think of a single attribute of non-existence that the law of gravity didn't have, or a single scientific attribute of existence it did have, and yet it is still common sense to believe that it existed. So I hope that makes a little bit more sense now. That was a tough section. This, he said, explains why a class full of freshman composition students arrives at similar ratings of quality in the compositions. They all have relatively similar backgrounds and similar knowledge. But if a group of foreign students were brought in, or say medieval poems out of the range of class experience were brought in, then the student's ability to rank quality would probably not correlate as well. And this explains also how different people of different tribes are so suspicious of each other and in fact, often virulently hate each other. They have different values. What could be more unitive or divisive than that? So again, go to Jonathan Haidt's Righteous Mind. The left and the right have really different values. And we are seeing that problem coming to a crescendo, obviously. It's exactly why we need a paradigm shift, a different way of seeing value in the world. In the conversation I just had with Mary Cohan, she used the word valuing, and we don't look at the valuing, we look at the manifest values when we should be looking at the valuing, because chances are that mechanism of valuing is the same in everyone. So a good way to understand other people is to understand their valuing process, not their actual values. In a sense, he said, it's the student's choice of quality that defines him. People differ about quality not because quality is different, but because people are different in terms of experience. He speculated that if two people had identical a priori analogs, they would see quality identically every time. There's no way to test this, however, so it had to remain just speculation. I don't think there's any way you could possibly test that. But let's look at something that's kind of interesting in the way we see the modern world. So Scandinavia and other European countries did really well with forms of socialism, social democracy, and it worked very well because everyone was homogenous. It was a homogenous society. As soon as there was more globalization, more immigration, that social system stopped working the way it used to. And it's not because the immigrants were bad and were taking advantage of the system. I mean, I don't think you could say it as simplistically as that. In an answer to his colleagues at school, he wrote, and this is where he's going to sum it up for his academic peers, so this is important. Any philosophic explanation of quality is going to be both false and true precisely because it is a philosophic explanation. The process of philosophic explanation is an analytical process, the process of breaking something down into subjects and predicates. What I mean, and everybody else means, by the word quality cannot be broken down into subjects and predicates. This is not because quality is so mysterious, but because quality is so simple, immediate, and direct. The easiest intellectual analog of pure quality that people in our environment can understand is that quality is the response of an organism to its environment. He used this example because his chief questioners seemed to see things in terms of stimulus-response behavior theory. An amoeba placed on a plate of water with a drip of dilute sulfuric acid placed nearby will pull away from the acid, I think. If we could speak to the amoeba without knowing anything about sulfuric acid, we could say, this environment has poor quality. If it had a nervous system, it would act in a more complex way to overcome the poor quality of the environment. It would seek analogs, that is, images and symbols from its previous experience to define the unpleasant nature of its new environment and thus understand it. So even an amoeba can detect quality, this implies. Does that mean the detection of quality is only present in life forms? Logically, we think this, which leaves the problem of what does it mean that quality is everything? Is it just, is everything only in the eyes of a biological entity that can perceive it? If we were to say that everything detects quality, then that would be, I guess, the word being used in our corner these days is panpsychism. But is that bad? Also, here, look at the use of the word behaviorism. Pirsig was dealing with the black box approach to psychology, and in the middle of the 20th century, Skinner's behaviorism became the paradigm. This is, the putting aside Freud. Freud is wrong. He's wrong about everything. What we have is the black box, which means psychology locked both the front and the back doors to looking into the brain. The brain, what was going on in the brain didn't count. All that mattered, what was coming in and what came out. And that's all you studied. And that was psychology for quite some time. In our highly complex organic state, we advanced organisms respond to our environment with an invention of many marvelous analogs. We invent earth and heavens, trees, stones, and oceans, gods, music, arts, language, philosophy, engineering, civilization, and science. We call these analogs reality, and they are reality. We mesmerize our children in the name of truth into knowing that they are reality. We throw anyone who does not accept these analogs into an insane asylum. But that which causes us to invent the analogs is quality. Quality is the continuing stimulus which our environment puts upon us to create the world in which we live. All of it, every last bit of it. That's hard to stomach, I think, for some people, this every last bit of it, all of it. And we find it hard to believe. Yet when an amoeba sees good and bad environment, that's its reality, and it responds accordingly. And we find that to be an acceptable understanding of the amoeba's, let's just say, experience. So why is it so hard to accept the same process in us, and that it's just a more complex version that involves the ability we've developed to abstract and the subsequent layering of analogs from that ability to abstract? We're amoebas with complicated bodies and giant brains, but the stimulus is still the same. At the bottom of all those analogs, and emergent ghosts and hypnotism, and go back to chapter 3 about hypnotism, it takes to necessarily sustain this very productive way of being in the world. At the bottom of it, we're still amoebas. Now, to take that which has caused us to create the world and include it within the world we have created is clearly impossible. That is why quality cannot be defined. If we do define it, we are defining something less than quality itself. I remember this fragment more vividly than any of the others, possibly because it is the most important of all. When he wrote it, he felt momentary fright and was about to strike out the words, all of it, every last bit of it. Madness there. I think he saw it. But he couldn't see any logical reason to strike these words out, and it was too late now for faint-heartedness. He ignored his warning and let the words stand. This is the most important fragment of all in my estimation, because it refutes the perceived and pervasive notion that the undefinable is either unimportant or of lesser importance, or can be explained away. Here, the mystical, undefinable perception of quality is denoted as being the parent of all reality. He put his pencil down and then felt something let go, as though something internal had been strained too hard and given away. Then it was too late. Sounds like a shifting paradigm to me. He began to see that he had shifted away from his original stand. He was no longer talking about a metaphysical trinity, but an absolute monism. Quality was the source and substance of everything. A whole new flood of philosophic associations came to mind. Hegel had talked like this with his absolute mind. Absolute mind was independent too, both of objectivity and subjectivity. I don't know enough about Hegel to say much here, but fortunately, Pearson's going to talk us through this. And again, if you do, leave some comments. However, Hegel said the absolute mind was the source of everything, but then excluded romantic experience from the everything. It was the source of Hegel's, from the everything it was the source of. Hegel's absolute was completely classical, completely rational, completely orderly. Steven Pinker. Quality was not like that. Phaedrus remembered Hegel had been regarded as a bridge between Western and Oriental philosophy. The Vedanta of the Hindus, the way of the Taoists, even the Buddha had been described as an absolute monism similar to Hegel's philosophy. Phaedrus doubted at the time, however, whether mystical ones and metaphysical monisms were introconvertible, since mystical ones follow no rules and metaphysical monisms do. His quality was a metaphysical entity, not a mystic one. Or was it? What was the difference? Well, they're both monisms. Maybe the knife is being used incorrectly. He answered himself that the difference was one of definition. Metaphysical entities are defined, mystical ones are not. That made quality mystical. No, it was really both. Although he thought of it purely in philosophical terms up to now as metaphysical, he had all along refused to define it. That made it mystic, too. Its indefinability freed it from the rules of metaphysics. So, is quality mystical or metaphysical? Both? How can it be both at once? Maybe to help us understand that, we need some help from a very old book. Then, on impulse, Phaedrus went over to his bookshelf and picked out a small blue cardboard-bound book. He'd hand-copied this book and bound it himself years before when he couldn't find a copy for sale anywhere. It was a 2,400-year-old Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu. He began to read through the lines he had read many times before, but this time he studied it to see if a certain substitution would work. He began to read and interpret it at the same time. No comment is needed when the Tao Te Ching gets involved. Any text speaks for itself. It's that. He read, "The quality that can be defined is not the absolute quality." That was what he had said. The names that can be given it are not absolute names. It is the origin of heaven and earth. When named, it is the mother of all things. Exactly. That's the first verse of the Tao Te Ching. Quality, romantic quality and its manifestations, classic quality, are in their nature the same. It is given different names, subjects and objects, when it becomes classically manifest. Romantic quality and classic quality together may be called mystic. Reaching from mystery into deeper mystery, it is the gate to the secret of life. Quality is all-pervading, and its use is inexhaustible, fathomless, like the fountainhead of all things. Yet crystal clear like water, it seems to remain. I do not know whose son it is, an image of what existed before God. Continuously, it seems to remain. Draw upon it, and it serves you with ease. Looked at, but cannot be seen. Listened to, but cannot be heard. Grasped at, but cannot be touched. These three elude all our inquiries, and hence blend and become one. Not by its rising is there light, not by its sinking is there darkness. Unceasing, continuous, it cannot be defined. It reverts again to the realm of nothingness. That is why it is called the form of the formless, the image of the nothingless. That is why it's called elusive. Meet it, and you do not see its face. Follow it, and you do not see its back. He who holds fast to the quality of old is able to know the primeval beginnings, which are the continuity of quality. Now, the only thing I'm going to add, because I think that, enough said again, is that there's a translation that I recommend that I think you'll like. It's Stephen Mitchell's, and Stephen Mitchell put together several Western translations. He didn't translate it from Chinese. He went through the Western translations, German, English, obviously, and some other languages I can't remember. And he extracted out the essence. So it's a version, I guess you'd say, in simple and modern language. So I'm going to put a link to that PDF so you can read it for yourself. Phaedrus read on through line after line, verse after verse of this. Watch them match, fit, slip into place. Exactly. This was what he meant. This was what he'd been saying all along, only poorly, mechanistically. There was nothing vague or inexact about this book. It was as precise and definite as it could be. It was what he had been saying, only in a different language with different roots and origins. He was from another valley, seeing what was in this valley. Not now as a story told by strangers, but as part of the valley he was from. He was seeing it all. Part of the valley he was from. Why not the top of the mountain? The eastern way of seeing things is from the valley, and the western way of seeing things is from the mountaintop. That's why the only Zen at the mountaintop is the one you bring with you. He had broken the code. He read on, line after line, page after page, not a discrepancy. What he had been talking about all the time as quality was here the Tao, the great central generating force of all religions, Oriental and Occidental, past and present, all knowledge, everything. So what would the responsibility of coming across this knowledge do to someone? I'm going to refer you to the Matrix movie. I mean, the reason that is so mythologically important, the reason that is so popular, and why we're always referencing the Matrix is imagine that moment when you know you're in the Matrix. What is that going to do to you? Then in his mind's eye, he looked up and caught his own image and realized where he was and what he was seeing. And I don't know what really happened, but now the slippage that Phaedrus had felt earlier, the internal parting of his mind suddenly gathered momentum, as do rocks at the top of the mountain. Before he could stop it, the sudden accumulated mass of awareness began to grow and grow into an avalanche of thought, and awareness out of control, with each additional growth of the downward tearing mass loosening hundreds of times its volume, and then that mass uprooting hundreds of times its volume more, and then hundreds of times that, on, wider and broader, until there was nothing left to stand, no more anything. It all gave way from under him. So talking about mysticism, you might call this a mystical experience, but not a very good one. Let's call this the worst trip he's ever had. You've seen through to reality, and it's not the reality that anyone else sees, and yet you know it's reality. Madness there. So thanks for hanging in for this very long episode. It was necessary for me not to leave a word out, and I hope that made sense that I did that, and I will see you next Sunday for Chapter 21.